My name is Olivia. I'm 28 years old, and I've been married to Daniel for 5 years. Our marriage wasn't a fairy tale, but we tried to keep it afloat. Routine, compromises, and rare moments of warmth. Daniel worked as a night shift security guard at a warehouse, while I was an administrator at a beauty salon. We lived in a small town called Pskov, where everyone knew each other, but no one openly interfered in others' lives. It seemed like a quiet existence, but everything changed after what seemed like a simple furniture problem. It all started when I noticed a strange powder on the floor in the living room. At first, I thought it was dust, but then I saw tiny holes in the leg of our old wooden table. Daniel immediately knew what it was: woodworms. We tried home remedies, but the insects seemed to mock us. Every morning, their traces appeared in new places. We had to call a pest control service. The specialists delivered their verdict. The entire apartment needed treatment, and we would have to leave for a week. We racked our brains trying to figure out where to go. Renting another place was too expensive, our friends' homes were too crowded, and my parents' place was too far. Then Daniel suggested we stay with his father, Victor, in Old Rusa. He lived alone, and there would be enough space. I froze. Victor Sergeyevich, Daniel's father, was a tall, lean man with piercing eyes. He was always quiet, and I found him hard to read. Being around him made me tense. When we arrived at his old wooden house on the edge of town, surrounded by a garden, I felt uneasy. The house looked well kept, but seemed to hold secrets. Victor greeted us at the gate. "Come in. Make yourselves at home," he said calmly. The house was cool and smelled of old wood. He led us to a room with a narrow bed, heavy curtains, and creaky floorboards. Daniel went to sleep after his shift, but I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds of this new place. That evening, Daniel left for his night shift, leaving me alone with Victor. I tried to read, but my heart was racing. Suddenly, I heard 3 soft knocks. "Olivia, I made some soup. Would you like to join me?" Victor's voice was soft. I hesitated but went to the kitchen. Victor was already sitting at the table wearing a simple shirt rolled up to his elbows. His tanned arm showed veins, and for some reason, that detail caught my attention. We ate in silence. I noticed how he watched me from under his brow. His gaze was too long, too intense. "Uncomfortable here?" he suddenly asked. "Just a new place. I'll get used to it," I replied, forcing a smile. "I don't bite," he said with a slight smirk. I quickly finished dinner and returned to the room, but I couldn't sleep. His cold, studying gaze lingered in my mind, sending shivers down my spine, not just from anxiety. The next morning, I woke up earlier than Daniel, put on a light robe, and went to the kitchen for coffee. Victor was already there reading a newspaper. His gaze slid over me, and I felt my cheeks flush. "Good morning," he said hoarsely, folding the newspaper. "Good morning," I replied, avoiding his eyes. I poured myself coffee, feeling his gaze on my back. At one point, I turned around and he quickly looked away, but something inside me stirred. His gaze wasn't accidental. Later, I decided to help with cleaning. I put on a tight t-shirt and shorts, tied my hair in a ponytail, and started mopping the hallway. Victor came out of his room, and I noticed his gaze linger on my legs. My chest tightened. I deliberately stood up slowly, meeting his eyes. He clenched his jaw and walked past without a word. That evening, Daniel came home from work and went straight to bed. I stayed in the living room watching TV. Victor silently joined me. We sat on the couch, just a few centimeters apart. I felt the warmth of his body and glanced at his strong arms. "Do you miss home?" he suddenly asked. "A little," I whispered. "I'm glad you're here," he said, his voice softer. My heart raced. I was married, but being near this man made me feel different. Dangerous, forbidden, yet thrilling. That night, I had a strange dream. Warm, strong hands embraced me, and a whisper sounded in my ear. I woke up in a sweat, my pulse pounding. It was 2:40 a.m. A strip of moonlight shone through the curtains, and I heard soft footsteps outside the door. I froze. The steps stopped, and I saw a shadow under the door. They stood there for a long time. I didn't move. Then the footsteps faded. I clung to Daniel, who slept soundly as usual. But I knew. It was Victor. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy heart. The memory of the footsteps haunted me. Maybe I was overthinking it. The house was old. The floors creaked. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't forget how his shadow lingered at the door. Daniel left for his shift as usual, kissing me on the cheek without noticing my distracted state. I stayed alone. It was stuffy outside, so I put on a light blue summer dress with thin straps. Hoping the breeze would calm my nerves, I decided to walk in the garden. As I strolled between the old apple trees, I heard the gate creak. Victor stood by the fence, rolling up his sleeves. Our eyes met. "Getting some air?" he asked with a slight smile. "Yes, it's too stuffy inside," I replied, feeling the dress cling to my skin in the heat. He stepped closer, his gaze sliding over my shoulders and collarbone. I clenched my fingers but didn't step back. "These apple trees should have been cut down long ago," he said, as if justifying his presence. "They have their own history," I breathed, not knowing why I said that. He didn't reply, just held his gaze on my lips. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Come, I'll show you something," Victor said, turning toward the shed. I hesitated but followed. Inside, it was dark and smelled damp. He turned on a lamp, and the dim light illuminated shelves of tools. On one of them lay a wooden box. "Open it," he offered. I lifted the lid. Inside was an antique bracelet with an oak leaf pattern. "It belonged to my wife," he said quietly. "It's beautiful," I whispered, unable to take my eyes off it. He stepped closer, his breath warm on my neck. His hand brushed mine as he touched the bracelet. His fingers were rough but warm. I didn't move. "It suits you," he said. I felt my cheeks flush. I turned and quickly left the shed. The air outside felt heavy. That night, I heard footsteps again. This time, I got up and approached the door. My heart pounded. Through the crack, I saw the same shadow. It didn't move, as if waiting. I froze, gripping the doorknob. After a minute, the footsteps retreated. The next morning, Daniel acted as if nothing was wrong. I tried to talk about feeling uncomfortable in the house, but he just shrugged. "Dad's a quiet guy. He's normal." I fell silent. Who could I tell about the unease caused by mere glances and footsteps? I decided to take control. I went shopping and bought a dark green dress with a thigh-high slit. I wore it to dinner. Victor couldn't hide his surprise when he saw me. His gaze lingered on my collarbone again. We ate in silence. I played with my fork, feeling his eyes on my legs. Finally, he broke the silence. "You look especially beautiful tonight." "Thank you," I smiled. Something flickered in his eyes, something daring, and I felt uneasy, but not from fear, from something else. Late that night, I heard footsteps again, but this time they didn't stop at the door. They slowly descended the stairs to the living room. I went out into the hallway, wearing a silk nightgown, and followed. Victor sat in the dim light on the couch, his shirt unbuttoned, holding a glass of amber liquid. "Can't sleep?" I asked. "And you?" He raised an eyebrow. I slowly approached and sat in the chair across from him. My bare feet nervously pressed into the carpet. He noticed. I bit my lip. Silence hung between us. At one point, he leaned forward and ran his fingers along the edge of my nightgown, as if by accident. I didn't move, sitting with my arms wrapped around myself. I didn't understand what was happening, but I felt we had both gone too far. The next morning, I decided to talk to Daniel, but in the bathroom, I found his phone. The screen lit up from a random touch. There was a conversation with someone named Max. The messages were short, but a few phrases were enough. "I miss you. When will we meet again?" I froze, realizing my husband had been living a double life. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen. More messages came in. "Max, I miss you too. Can't wait to see you." The screen went dark. I gripped the phone until my fingers turned white. It felt like a punch to the gut. Everything I had tried to ignore, Daniel's coldness, the lack of intimacy, his constant irritation, suddenly made sense. My husband was living a double life. I threw the phone on the bed, pressed my hands to my face, and felt my heart racing. We had been married for 5 years, and he was with another man. I felt more than hurt. It was a betrayal I couldn't comprehend. I didn't know whether I was more angry or confused. The sound of running water came from the bathroom. Daniel was showering after his shift. Suspicious, I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and scrolled through the messages. They went back months. "Max, did you like last night?" "Yeah, it was something. Until next time." I couldn't read further. Rage boiled inside me. I wanted to burst into the bathroom, throw the phone in his face, scream. But then I cooled down. No, I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a scene. I wouldn't give him that power. I returned the phone to the nightstand and went out into the hallway. Victor was sitting in the living room wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, holding a cup of coffee. His gaze slowly rose to me. I must have looked shattered because he frowned. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "Just didn't sleep well." "I understand," he replied, but there was skepticism in his voice. I turned toward the kitchen but felt his gaze on my back, where it always was. This time, I didn't care. The whole day I avoided Daniel. He slept until evening, ate dinner in silence, and left for his shift, muttering a casual, "Good night." I nodded but said nothing. As soon as the door closed behind him, I sat on the edge of the couch and ran my hand over my face. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a line and didn't know if I had the courage to cross it. "Everything okay?" I heard Victor's voice. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame. I glanced at him. In the dim light, he looked younger, sharp cheekbones, slightly disheveled hair, and a gaze I had stopped fearing. I slowly shook my head. "No." He silently sat in the chair across from me. "Daniel," I swallowed. "He's cheating on me. With a man." Victor's eyes widened slightly. He slowly leaned back. "I didn't know." "Neither did I said bitterly. 5 years. 5 damn years." He was silent. Suddenly I felt tears welling up, but I didn't want to cry. I pressed my lips together and lifted my chin. His gaze softened. "You're strong, Olivia. I've always seen that." I laughed shortly. "Sitting here in someone else's house while my husband? I don't want to be strong." I covered my face with my hands and suddenly felt his warm palm over mine. I froze. His fingers were rough, but the touch was gentle. He slowly lowered my hand, and our eyes met. Silence hung between us. "I see you," he whispered. I don't know who made the first move, but the next moment his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft, cautious, but there was a restrained strength behind it. I didn't resist. My fingers slid over his neck and he gripped my waist. I felt heat spreading through my body. "We shouldn't," I whispered, breaking the kiss. "I know," he replied, but didn't let go. I stood up from the couch and slowly walked to the hallway. He followed, not taking his eyes off me. I entered the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. A second later, he followed and quietly closed it. We didn't say a word. His hands rested on my shoulders, his fingers slowly sliding down the straps of my nightgown, feeling the fabric slip down, revealing my skin. His breath burned my neck. In that moment, I forgot everything. That night, I lay pressed against him, listening to his steady breathing. My heart raced. I knew reality would come tomorrow, but for now I felt alive. At dawn, Victor returned to his room, and I lay wrapped in the sheets, staring at the ceiling. When Daniel came home in the morning, I met him with a steady gaze. He walked past me without noticing how my hands trembled, but I knew I would never be the same again. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy chest. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind like scenes from an old movie. I still felt the traces of his touch on my skin, a mix of anxiety and unbearable excitement. I had cheated on my husband with his father. It seemed insane. But what was even more insane was that I felt no remorse. Daniel slept next to me, his face buried in the pillow. I looked at him and didn't understand how I had deceived myself for so long. His coldness, his distance, his constant busyness. And now these messages from Max. My husband had been living a double life, and all this time I had been trying to save something that no longer existed. I quietly got up, put on my robe, and left the room. Victor was already in the kitchen, standing by the window with a cup of coffee. Hearing my footsteps, he turned. Our eyes met, and I felt something shift inside me. "Good morning," he whispered. "Good morning," I replied, hiding behind the scent of my robe. He slowly set the cup on the table and stepped closer. I couldn't look away. In his eyes, I saw a mix of guilt, determination, and something else, something I could only describe as desire. He ran his fingers over my wrist, and I shivered. "This shouldn't have happened," he said quietly. "I know," I whispered, though my skin yearned for him. But it had happened. I didn't reply, just turned and left the kitchen before I did something reckless. But as I walked back to the room, I felt his gaze on me, a gaze that haunted me all day. That evening, Daniel left for his shift as usual. I went out into the garden, trying to find peace among the scent of wet grass and old apple trees. Soon I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Victor stood a few steps away, holding garden shears. "It's going to be a warm night," he said, not taking his eyes off my face. "Yes," I replied, swallowing. We stood in silence as the garden filled with the scent of a summer evening, and tension hung thick between us like the air before a storm. "Why did you stay with Daniel for so long?" he suddenly asked. "I thought love was about patience, that he would change over time. But now I think patience sometimes turns us into victims." He didn't reply, but I saw his jaw tighten. I took a step forward. He didn't retreat. My hand reached for his shoulder on its own. The tension grew deeper, and then he grabbed my waist and pulled me to him. The kiss was sharp, greedy, desperate. His hands pressed into my back, and I clung to him as tightly as I could. We didn't notice when the rain started. Drops streamed down our faces, our clothes clinging to our bodies. Victor ran his hand over my face, brushing away wet hair. "We need to stop," he said heavily. "We can't," I replied, looking into his eyes. He knew I was right. We didn't hear the front door open. Daniel's voice cut through the air like a knife. "What's going on here?" We froze. I slowly turned my head. My husband stood in the doorway, his face pale, eyes blazing with anger. He looked at us, then his gaze stopped on my hand, resting on Victor's chest. "Dad," Daniel's voice broke. I tried to say something, but my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. Victor stepped back, but it was too late. Daniel lunged forward, fists clenched. "You're with my father?" he asked, staring at me. I was silent. "And you?" He turned to Victor. "How could you?" "Daniel, calm down," Victor tried to say, but it sounded unconvincing. Daniel rushed at him. I screamed. They collided in the middle of the room. Victor tried to hold him back, but Daniel threw the first punch. A dry crack echoed in the silence. Victor staggered, clutching his cheek. Daniel swung again, but Victor caught his arm. They fell to the floor, knocking over the table, shattering a vase. I ran over, grabbing Daniel's shoulder. "Stop!" I shouted. He turned sharply. His eyes burned with rage. "This is all because of you," he yelled and shoved me. I fell to the floor, hitting my shoulder. Victor roared like a wounded animal and tackled his son, pinning him to the floor, twisting his arm. "Calm down," he growled. "You lost her yourself." Daniel froze. Dead silence hung in the air. "I never mattered to you anyway," he exhaled, looking at me. "You've despised me for a long time." I was silent. He was right. Victor released his son and stood up. Daniel remained on the floor, breathing heavily. I slowly got up, pressing my hand to my shoulder. "I'm filing for divorce," I said quietly. Daniel snorted. "I'm not stopping you." He stood, swayed, wiped blood from his lip, and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Victor approached me, cautiously touching my shoulder. "Are you okay?" I nodded. We stood in the room where everything had been turned upside down. "We can't go back," I whispered. "Do you want to?" he asked, leaning closer. I slowly shook my head. He embraced me. That night, we sat on the couch for a long time, not saying a word. But I knew that by morning, everything would change. We had crossed a line from which there was no return.